The Hells Angels biker helped a lost little girl clean an abandoned garage, and a buried secret erupted in flames. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. As the hours passed, the storm outside only seemed to grow fiercer. The wind howled through the cracks in the garage walls, and snow piled up in thick drifts against the windows. Inside, Jake sat in the corner, leaning against the workbench, his eyes watching Emma carefully. She had finally stopped crying, her small frame curled up under the blankets he had draped over her. But the fear was still there, lingering in her eyes. He couldn't blame her. She was alone in a world she didn't understand. He had never been good at comforting anyone, let alone a lost child. But something about her reminded him of himself when he was younger, when everything seemed so uncertain. Jake took a deep breath, trying to shake off the memories of his own painful past. He needed to focus on Emma now. She needed him, even if he wasn't sure how to help her. He walked over to the small kitchen area in the corner of the garage and began rummaging through the cabinets. He wasn't much of a cook, but he knew how to make a decent meal if he needed to. As he prepared some sandwiches and soup, he couldn't help but think about what had brought him here, to this garage, this life of solitude. For years, he had been running from his past. He had joined the Hells Angels for the camaraderie, for the sense of belonging. But over time, he had learned that the club didn't offer protection, it demanded loyalty at a price. And that price was too high for Jake to continue paying. He had left the club years ago, cutting all ties with the only family he had ever known. Now, here he was, alone in a rundown garage with a girl who had no one. No family, no protection. He set the food down in front of Emma and sat beside her. She looked up at him, her small eyes filled with uncertainty. "Are you hungry?" Jake asked softly. Emma nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she picked up the spoon. She hadn't said much since they'd arrived at the garage. But that was okay. Jake wasn't in any hurry to make her talk. He just needed her to feel safe. As she ate, Jake's mind wandered back to the events that had led him here. He had spent years on the road, fighting battles that were never his, losing pieces of himself along the way. And now, in this small, cold garage, he was faced with a choice he never thought he'd have to make. He could keep running, keep living his life the way he always had, alone, detached, and distant. Or he could choose to stay and help this little girl find the safety and comfort she desperately needed. Jake wasn't sure if he was capable of the latter. He wasn't sure if he could open up enough to be the person she needed him to be. But something deep inside him told him he had to try. He wasn't sure why, but he knew he couldn't leave her. She had already opened a door in his heart he thought was long closed. Emma finished her soup and looked up at Jake, her face still a little pale but much calmer than before. "I'm scared," she whispered. Jake's heart tightened at the vulnerability in her voice. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, trying to offer her what little comfort he could. "I know," he said softly, "but you're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." Emma nodded, but Jake could tell she wasn't fully convinced. And he didn't blame her. Trust was a fragile thing, especially for someone who had already been let down by the world. They sat there for a while, the sound of the storm outside drowning out everything else. Jake wasn't sure how long they had been sitting in silence when Emma finally spoke again. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Jake looked at her, his gaze softening. "Because I can," he said simply. "And because I don't want anyone to feel the way you do right now. Alone. Scared. Not knowing where to go." Emma's eyes filled with tears again, but this time, they weren't the tears of panic and fear from earlier. They were the tears of someone who had found a small glimmer of hope in a world that seemed to have none. Jake felt something shift inside him as he watched her. This wasn't just about helping a lost child. It was about finding his own way back from the dark path he had been on for so long. The storm outside was still raging, but inside, in that small, dusty garage, something had begun to change. For both of them, they were both lost, but they were no longer alone. And for the first time in years, Jake allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could both find their way out of the darkness together. The next few days passed slowly in the garage. The snow continued to fall outside, But the warmth of the small building provided a kind of comfort neither Jake nor Emma had experienced in a long time. Jake had found some old blankets and pillows for her, and she spent most of her time curled up on the couch, reading old magazines or looking through the small stash of books Jake kept in the corner. The storm outside didn't seem as frightening with Emma there. She had become a strange sort of anchor for him. He wasn't used to being needed. The Hell's Angels had taught him to rely only on himself, to trust no one. But Emma was different. She had no one else. He couldn't leave her. Jake had spent the last few years hiding from the world, locking away the pieces of himself that had gotten broken over the years. But now, with Emma in the garage, something inside him was starting to crack open. He found himself staying up late, tinkering with the engine of his old bike, but his thoughts kept wandering back to her. She was so small, so fragile, and yet she had managed to survive on her own. Her quiet strength reminded him of the woman who had raised him, his grandmother, who had passed away years ago. She had been kind, patient, and strong, everything Jake had never allowed himself to be. As the days went on, Emma started talking more. At first, it was just small talk about the snow or the books she was reading, but slowly, she began to open up. She told Jake about her life before the storm, about her mom, and how they had moved from one town to another, never staying in one place for too long. Mom said we had to keep moving because of the people who were looking for us, Emma whispered one night as they sat in the dim light of the garage. Jake didn't ask for more details, but he could tell there was fear in her words. He didn't need to know who those people were, but he knew enough to understand that she had been running from something. Something bad. You're safe now, Emma, Jake said, trying to sound reassuring, though he wasn't sure if he believed the words himself. You can stay here as long as you need. Emma gave him a small, sad smile. Thanks, Jake. I don't know what I would have done without you. Her words hit Jake harder than he expected. It wasn't just the kindness in her voice, it was the way she was trusting him, depending on him to keep her safe. It made him feel something he hadn't felt in years, responsibility. And with that responsibility came guilt. He wasn't sure he was the right person to protect her, but he knew he couldn't let her down. The next morning, Jake woke up to find the storm had finally passed. The sun was out, and the world outside was covered in a blanket of fresh snow. He stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street, when Emma walked up behind him. What do we do now? She asked. Jake turned to look at her. Now we fix things, he said, the words coming out more confident than he felt. He wasn't sure how to fix everything, his past, her fear, their broken lives, but he knew he had to start somewhere. He had started fixing bikes when he was young, learning from his father. And now, it seemed, he had something else to fix. Together, they stepped outside into the cold morning air. The snow crunched under their feet as they made their way to the garage. Jake had the tools, and Emma had the determination. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, and she wasn't afraid to help him. They worked together to clear the snow from the driveway and organize the garage. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he was part of something again. Not part of the Hell's Angels, but something better, a family. They spent the day working side by side, and as the sun began to set, the garage started to look like a place that could be called home. But as they were cleaning out one of the back rooms, they stumbled upon something unexpected. At the back of the room, hidden beneath an old tarp, was a box. It was heavy, and when Jake opened it, the first thing he saw was a pile of old documents. But as he dug deeper, he uncovered something that made his heart stop, a stack of cash, wrapped tightly in brown paper. He stared at it for a moment, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There was a lot of money in that box, more than Jake had ever seen in his life. And then it hit him. This wasn't just any money. This was the kind of money that people would kill for. He closed the box quickly, his mind racing. The last thing he needed was to get tangled up in something illegal again. He had left that life behind. But as he looked at Emma, sitting on the floor next to him, something in him shifted. He couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not after everything he had promised her. The next morning, Jake decided it was time to figure out what was going on. He couldn't leave the garage without knowing the truth. And as much as he wanted to protect Emma from whatever danger might be tied to this money, he knew he had to face it head on. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. This was just the beginning of a much bigger story. The next few days felt like a blur to Jake. Every time he thought he could relax, something else seemed to pop up. The box of money he'd found in the garage weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't get rid of the nagging feeling that it was connected to something far bigger than him. The only thing that kept him grounded was Emma. She was still so young, so trusting, and Jake knew that she depended on him, even if she didn't say it out loud. She had started to settle in, adjusting to the rhythms of the garage. Her presence was a comfort to Jake. He hadn't realized how much he missed having someone around, someone who actually needed him. It was strange. Before Emma came into his life, Jake had been perfectly fine with being alone. But now, it felt different. Now, he felt a sense of responsibility, not just for the garage, but for her too. He couldn't just walk away from her now, not after everything they had been through. But as the days passed, the storm outside had passed, and so did the quiet. That's when the trouble began. It started with a knock on the door. It wasn't unusual for someone to stop by the garage. It was still a functioning place for those who needed repairs, even though Jake wasn't actively taking customers anymore. But when Jake opened the door, he wasn't expecting to see who stood there. It was a man he hadn't seen in years. A man from his past. Jake Thompson, the man said, his voice low and cold. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The man was tall, with a face that looked like it had seen too many fights. His eyes were cold, scanning Jake with an almost predatory gaze. Been a long time, the man said, as if they were old friends. Jake didn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to figure out why this man was here and what he wanted. What do you want? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man took a step forward, his boots making a heavy sound on the concrete. I think you know why I'm here, the man said. That box you found. It doesn't belong to you, Jake. Jake's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what the man was talking about. The money. The hidden treasure that had now become a burden. I don't know what you're talking about, Jake lied. You think I'm stupid? The man said with a cruel laugh. I've been watching you. I know you found it. And I'm here to make sure it comes back to the right people. Jake's fists clenched at his sides. He didn't want to get involved in this. He didn't want to go back to the dangerous life he had left behind. But he knew there was no walking away from it now. I'm not giving it back. To anyone, Jake said firmly. It's mine now. The man's face darkened. You don't have a choice, Jake, he said. You never did. Jake took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He had been in tight situations before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about Emma. If he got tangled up in this, if he let this man intimidate him, then Emma could get hurt. And Jake wasn't going to let that happen. Get off my property, Jake said, his voice low and steady. The man narrowed his eyes, but he didn't move. You think you can stop me? He asked. Jake nodded. Yeah, I do. For a moment, the man just stood there, sizing him up. Then he scoffed and took a step back. This isn't over, Jake, the man said, his voice full of threat. We'll be back, and you'll wish you gave it to us. Jake didn't say anything. He just watched as the man turned and walked away, his heavy footsteps echoing in the stillness of the garage. The door shut with a soft click, and Jake was left alone with his thoughts. But the peace didn't last long. As soon as the man was gone, Jake's mind started to race. He couldn't ignore what had just happened. The money, the threat, it was all tied together. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't keep Emma here. Not with people like that after him. He had to get rid of the money, but how? And more importantly, what would he do to protect her? The answer was clear. He had to leave. He couldn't stay in the garage any longer. He couldn't keep hiding. It was time to face his past and put it to rest once and for all. Jake turned to Emma, who had been watching him from the doorway. She was standing there, her small face filled with worry. What happened, Jake? She asked softly. Jake walked over to her and knelt down, so he was eye level with her. We have to leave, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's not safe here anymore. But I'm going to keep you safe. I promise. Emma nodded, her big brown eyes filled with trust. She didn't ask questions, didn't wonder why or how. She just trusted him. And that was all. That mattered. Jake knew what he had to do. He wasn't just going to protect Emma from the people after him. He was going to protect her from everything. He was going to make sure she never had to run again. But before he could do any of that, he had to make one last decision. What would happen with the money? He knew that if he didn't take care of it, it would come back to haunt him. But getting rid of it wouldn't be easy. And it wouldn't come without consequences. But those were things Jake would have to face, just like everything else in his life. With a deep breath, Jake stood up, made his way to the back of the garage, and opened the box again. He knew he had to destroy it. And he would, because in the end, Nothing was more important than keeping Emma safe. Days passed quickly after Jake made the decision to leave. The garage, once filled with the comforting hum of tools and the smell of motor oil, now felt like a prison. He couldn't stay here any longer. The man who had threatened him was a reminder of a world Jake had left behind, a world filled with violence, fear, and the constant pressure to betray his own values. Jake had learned the hard way that some things were more important than loyalty to a group or a cause. Emma was one of those things. She was his responsibility now, and nothing else mattered. She had come to trust him, and Jake wasn't about to let her down. The storm outside had finally passed, and the sun began to peek through the clouds, casting a soft glow across the snow-covered landscape. It was a new day, but Jake felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. The money in the box was still there, a constant reminder of the danger that followed him. He couldn't keep running from it, but he also couldn't keep running from Emma. He had to make things right. "We need to go," Jake said, looking at Emma as she sat by the window, watching the world outside. Emma turned to him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice soft. Jake's heart tightened. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't even know what the future held, but he knew they couldn't stay here. "We're going to start over," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere you don't have to worry anymore." Emma smiled at him, and for a moment, Jake saw the little girl she truly was. She had been through so much, yet she still believed in the possibility of a better life. Jake envied that. He envied her ability to hope. The two of them packed up what little they had, leaving behind the remnants of a life Jake had tried so hard to forget. As they stepped outside, the cold air hit them, but it didn't feel as harsh as it once had. They had each other now. That was enough. The ride to the town Jake had in mind was long, the road slick with ice and snow, but it gave him time to think. He thought about the money, about the life he had left behind, and about Emma. She was his chance at redemption, his opportunity to do something right, something that mattered. When they arrived at the small, quiet town, Jake immediately felt the difference. The streets were clean, the people friendly, and the air smelled fresh. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Perfect. They found a small house on the edge of town, a modest place with a yard that would be big enough for Emma to play in. Jake wasn't sure how long they could stay here, but it didn't matter. For now, this was home. Jake spent the next few days getting settled, fixing up the house, and making sure everything was secure. He didn't know how much time they had before someone came looking for him, but he would protect Emma no matter what. She deserved a life without fear. As the days turned into weeks, the weight of his past started to lift. He found work at a local garage, fixing cars and motorcycles. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it allowed him to stay close to Emma. He even started to teach her a little about mechanics, letting her help him with small tasks. It was the first time in years that Jake had allowed himself to feel like he was part of something good. Emma blossomed in this new life. She was making friends at school, laughing more, and even starting to forget the trauma that had once defined her. But Jake knew that the past was never far behind. One night, as he was walking home from work, he saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was the man who had threatened him. Only now, he wasn't alone. There were others with him, all wearing the same cold, calculating look. Jake's heart sank as the realization hit him. The past had finally caught up with him. He turned quickly, walking in the opposite direction, but he could feel their eyes on him. He had to get back to Emma. He had to keep her safe. When Jake arrived home, he found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, drawing pictures. She looked up at him with a smile, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Jake forced a smile, trying to push the fear out of his voice. "Yeah, everything's fine," he lied. "Just a long day. You go ahead and finish your drawing." But as he watched her, the reality of their situation hit him harder than ever. He had promised Emma safety, a life free from fear. But how could he keep that promise if the past was still chasing them? Jake knew he couldn't run forever. The time had come to face his demons, to confront the people who had kept him trapped in a life of violence and betrayal. And when that day came, he would be ready. He would do whatever it took to protect Emma, to give her the life she deserved, no matter the cost. It had been a week since Jake had seen the man from his past, and the weight of that encounter still hung heavy in the air. Every day, as Jake went about his new routine, fixing bikes, helping Emma with her schoolwork, and making sure their small house was in order, He couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the past came knocking again. The last thing he wanted was to drag Emma into the mess he had left behind. He had promised her safety, peace, and a fresh start, but the people from his past didn't care about promises. They didn't care about anyone but themselves. Jake wasn't sure how long they could stay hidden in this small town. He didn't want to put Emma at risk, but he also knew that running again wasn't the solution. The moment he heard those familiar footsteps on the gravel outside, he knew the time had come to confront the past. The door creaked open, and there he was again, the same man who had threatened him weeks ago. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stood two other men, both towering figures with a cold, menacing air. Jake's heart rate quickened. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but here it was. Emma was in the other room, and for the first time in a long while, Jake didn't know how to protect her. The man stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "Jake Thompson," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've been running long enough. It's time to pay up." Jake stayed calm, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't owe you anything," he said, his gaze hardening. "You left me alone. I'm not coming back." The man laughed, the sound echoing through the empty house. "You think you can walk away? You think you can just disappear? You're in this, Jake, whether you like it or not." Jake stepped forward, blocking the door with his body. "If you want to fight, then fight me. Leave her out of this." The man's eyes flicked to the side, a sneer forming on his lips. "Don't worry, we're not here for the kid. We're here for you. The money you found, it's ours, and we're taking it back." Jake felt a surge of anger. He had made a decision that day, when he found the money, to protect Emma at all costs. He wasn't about to let these men ruin their lives again. "I don't have it," Jake said, his voice firm. "It's gone. I destroyed it. Now get out of my house." The man's face darkened. "You think I believe that?" he growled. "You can't hide from us, Jake. We'll find what we're looking for." The air between them grew thick with tension, but Jake wasn't going to back down. He had already lost so much, but not Emma. Not this time. "You'll never get it," Jake said, his voice calm but full of resolve. "And if you try to take her, I'll kill you first." The man didn't move, but Jake could see the hesitation in his eyes. For a moment, it felt like time had frozen. The world outside was quiet, the air still. But Jake knew that moment was fleeting. He had made his decision, and now it was time to face the consequences. Suddenly, the door behind Jake creaked open. Emma stood there, her small face pale but determined. "Jake, who are these people?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake's heart sank. He hadn't wanted her to be involved in this. He had promised her a safe life, away from everything he had run from. But now, there was no turning back. The man's eyes shifted to Emma, and for a split second, there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. "You really think you can protect her, Jake?" he sneered. "She's just a kid. She's not worth anything to us." Jake stepped between them, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're wrong. She's everything to me, and I'll die before I let you touch her." The man seemed to consider this for a moment, his cold eyes narrowing. Then, without a word, he turned to his men. "Let's go. We'll be back, Jake. And next time, you won't be so lucky." With that, they turned and walked out the door, leaving Jake standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. Emma didn't say anything, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't understand everything that had just happened, but she knew one thing. She was scared. And so was Jake. He couldn't let this happen again. The next day, Jake spent hours thinking about his options. He could leave. He could take Emma and run, disappear into the night. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. The people from his past would always find him. He had to end this once and for all. The next morning, Jake made a plan. He wasn't just going to fight for his freedom. He was going to fight for Emma's future. He would take the fight to them, face the consequences, and protect her at all costs. He wasn't running anymore. He was done running. This was his stand. And he would do whatever it took to keep Emma safe. The past had caught up with him, but Jake was ready to face it head on. The time for hiding was over. The next morning, Jake woke up early, the sky still dark with the last remnants of the night. He couldn't shake the feeling that today was the day everything would change. The man who had shown up at his doorstep, the threats, and the money, they were all a reminder that no matter how far he ran, the past would always catch up with him. He had spent years trying to leave it behind, but now he realized he couldn't keep running. He had to face it, and more importantly, He had to face it with Emma by his side. She deserved to be safe, and he wasn't going to let anything take that away from her. As he prepared to leave, he made sure Emma was still asleep in the small room at the back of the house. She had been through so much already, and Jake wasn't sure how much more she could take. But today, it wasn't about him anymore. It was about protecting her and doing whatever it took to make sure she had the future she deserved. He quickly grabbed his jacket, the weight of the leather familiar on his shoulders. The tools in the garage were ready. He had everything he needed. His plan wasn't complicated, but it was dangerous. He knew that. But Jake wasn't afraid of danger anymore. He had been afraid of so many things in his life. But now, standing in the quiet of the house, he felt the last of that fear slip away. It was time to face the past, and maybe, just maybe, close the door on it for good. The morning was cold, the air sharp against his face as he stepped outside and made his way toward the garage. He could hear the faint hum of the wind through the trees and the crunch of his boots against the frozen ground. The town was still waking up, the streets empty and silent. But he wasn't alone in his mission. Jake knew he couldn't do this by himself. The moment he'd made the decision to face the people who were after him, he knew he had to contact someone. A man who could help him, someone who had been part of his past, but not a part of the life he was trying to leave behind. This man, Steele, was from his Hells Angels days. He was the last person Jake had ever wanted to reach out to, but the situation had left him with no other choice. Steele was a force to be reckoned with, and while Jake wasn't sure he could trust him, he knew Steele would be able to help him take down the people who were threatening his future. After a brief phone call, Jake knew what he had to do. It wasn't a plan he liked, but it was the only option he had left. He needed to move quickly. The house had to be secured, and Emma had to stay hidden. Steele was on his way, but Jake couldn't afford to wait. As he worked in the garage, preparing the tools he needed, his mind kept drifting back to Emma. He had promised her safety, a life free of fear, and now, it seemed like he was doing everything he could to break that promise. He knew he couldn't protect her forever from the people after him, but he could do his best to protect her today. That was all he could do. Just as Jake was finishing his preparations, Steele arrived. The man stepped into the garage, his tall frame casting a shadow across the room. "You sure about this, Jake?" Steele asked, his voice low and steady. Jake looked at him, his expression hardened. "I don't have a choice. They won't stop until they get what they want. I'm not going to let them hurt her." Steele nodded, his eyes scanning the garage before resting on Jake. "We do this my way, and we get it done. No turning back after this." Jake knew that. Steele wasn't offering a way out, but he was offering a chance to make it right. And that was all Jake could ask for. The plan was simple. Find the men who had been chasing Jake and end it. But in the back of his mind, Jake knew it wouldn't be that simple. The men had resources, connections, and they were relentless. It was going to be a fight. But Jake wasn't afraid anymore. As they moved through the town, Jake kept his focus on Emma. He couldn't let anything happen to her. Steele had called in a few of his own men, bikers who had been part of the same crew as Jake. They were scattered across the town, waiting for Jake's signal. The tension in the air was thick as they made their way toward the abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. This was where the men who had been after Jake had been hiding, and it was where Jake planned to end it all. As they pulled up to the warehouse, Jake's heart pounded in his chest. The time had come. There was no going back now. Steele gave him a nod, and Jake knew the moment was upon them. The door creaked open slowly, and the men who had been waiting for them inside stepped forward, their faces hidden by masks. Jake's pulse quickened, but he kept his cool. He had to. The fight was about to begin, and there was no room for hesitation. "You made a big mistake, Jake," one of the men said, his voice muffled behind the mask. "You should have stayed away." Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. The first punch came fast, and the fight erupted into chaos. But Jake didn't flinch. He fought back, using every move he'd learned over the years, every ounce of strength he had. The fight was violent, raw, and unforgiving. But Jake wasn't thinking about the fight anymore. He was thinking about Emma, and he would do whatever it took to protect her. The fight had escalated quickly. Jake's fists were flying, his heart racing with every move. The men in front of him were relentless, but Jake wasn't backing down. He was too focused, too determined. Every punch, every kick, was driven by a singular purpose: protect Emma. The chaos around him faded into the background as Jake moved through the men one by one, his instincts taking over. He was used to this. The violence, the adrenaline, it was all part of his past. But now, there was something different. Every move he made, every hit he landed, was for her. For Emma. Steele and his men were fighting too, but Jake barely noticed them. It was like the world had narrowed to just him and the people threatening everything he had worked so hard for. The moment he had been dreading had arrived, and he wasn't going to let them take anything more from him. He had made his peace with the life he had left behind, but this was his chance to end it for good. To stop running. To protect the one person who mattered. As the fight dragged on, Jake started to tire. The men were skilled, but Jake had the advantage of years of experience. Still, he could feel his body protesting, the bruises already forming, the pain beginning to set in. He couldn't afford to let up. Not now. Not with Emma depending on him. Just as he landed another punch, he heard a sharp noise behind him. The door to the warehouse creaked open. A moment of hesitation, and in that instant, Jake's guard slipped. The man who had been leading the attack, the one who had threatened him at his house, lunged forward with a knife. Jake didn't have time to react. The knife slashed across his side, a hot rush of pain exploding through his body. For a second, everything went black. His knees buckled, but Jake managed to stay on his feet. He gritted his teeth, refusing to show weakness. His vision blurred, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He heard Steele shout from across the room, but Jake's focus was entirely on the man with the knife. He couldn't let him win. Not when Emma was still out there, alone and vulnerable. With every ounce of strength he had left, Jake surged forward, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it. The knife flew out of his hand, clattering across the floor. Jake didn't waste a second. He brought his fist down hard on the man's face, the impact sending him crashing to the ground. The warehouse fell silent. Jake stood there, panting, blood dripping from his side. His heart was pounding in his chest, but the danger had passed. He looked around at the men who had been attacking him. They were either unconscious or struggling to get up. Steele and his men had taken care of the rest. But Jake didn't have time to celebrate. He staggered toward the door, his vision spinning, pain making his movements slow. "Jake!" Steele called out to him, but Jake didn't stop. His only focus was getting back to Emma. He needed to make sure she was safe. As Jake stepped out into the cold night air, he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. But he couldn't stop now. He couldn't rest until Emma was safe. He stumbled to the small house, barely able to keep his balance. The door was locked, but Jake didn't hesitate. He kicked it open with one hard push and stepped inside. Emma was sitting in the kitchen, her wide eyes fixed on him. She looked scared, but not for herself. For him. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake limped toward her, trying to hide the pain. He didn't want her to see him like this, but there was no time to hide it. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're safe now." Emma stood up, running to him. Her small arms wrapped around his waist, and for a moment, Jake let himself relax. He hadn't realized how badly he needed this moment of peace, this moment of safety. But even as he stood there, holding Emma, he knew the fight wasn't over. He had won the battle, but the war was far from finished. The people from his past would keep coming, keep chasing him. He had no doubt about that. But for now, they were safe. For now, Emma had a chance. And that was all that mattered. Jake took a deep breath, holding Emma close. He wasn't going to let her go. Not now. Not ever. He had made a promise to her, and he wasn't about to break it. He would protect her, no matter what. It didn't matter how many enemies came after him. It didn't matter how many battles he had to fight. Jake had finally found something worth fighting for, and he wasn't going to lose it. Not again. The days after the fight were quiet, too quiet for Jake's liking. He had kept his promise to Emma, and for the first time in a long while, she was sleeping soundly. The house felt calm, almost peaceful, but the reality of their situation hadn't changed. Jake knew that as long as the men from his past were still out there, they would come back. He couldn't protect Emma forever if they kept coming after him. But for now, he had time. Time to think. Time to figure out what came next. The cut on his side was healing, but the ache in his chest hadn't gone away. He wasn't just fighting for his own freedom anymore. He was fighting for Emma's future. The town was still small, still peaceful, and Jake had settled into a routine. He had a steady job fixing bikes and working on cars at the local garage. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. It was a far cry from the life he had left behind, but it felt right. Emma had started school, and she was making friends. She smiled more often now, her laughter filling the house in a way Jake hadn't thought was possible. She was beginning to heal, and for that, Jake was grateful. But there were still nights when he couldn't sleep. Nights when his past caught up with him in his dreams, dragging him back into the darkness. He knew it was only a matter of time before the peace was shattered. One night, as Jake sat in the garage, working on an old motorcycle, he heard the familiar rumble of engines in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. He recognized the sound. He wasn't sure how many bikes were out there, but he could feel the presence of danger creeping closer. Jake wiped his hands on a rag and stood up, his mind racing. He knew what this meant. They were here. The men who had been after him were closing in. He couldn't waste any time. He quickly locked the garage door and grabbed his jacket. The cold wind hit him as soon as he stepped outside, and he looked down the street. It was a small town, and the streetlights flickered in the night, casting long shadows. He had no idea who these men were or how they had found him, but he knew they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. Jake's first thought was to get Emma out of the house, but he couldn't leave her alone. He had promised to protect her, and he wasn't about to break that promise now. As the engines grew louder, Jake sprinted back into the house, locking the door behind him. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, eating her dinner. She looked up as Jake entered, her face pale with concern. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's okay, Emma," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm. "You need to stay here. Don't open the door for anyone, okay?" Emma nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Jake kissed her forehead before running back outside. He had to face them. He couldn't let them hurt her. He didn't know how many men were out there, but he wasn't going down without a fight. The sound of the bikes grew louder. And soon enough, Jake saw the first one roll into view. It was a sleek, black motorcycle, its engine purring as the rider stopped in front of the house. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the rider removed his helmet. The man's face was familiar. It was the leader, the one who had threatened him weeks ago. He was here, and he wasn't alone. The rest of the men pulled up behind him, forming a line in front of the house. Jake stood tall, his fists clenched as he watched them. They had come for him, and they weren't leaving without a fight. He took a step forward, his voice steady but full of anger. "What do you want?" Jake demanded. The leader smiled, his eyes cold. "We've been looking for you, Jake. You can't run from the past forever." Jake didn't back down. "I'm not running from anything," he said. "I'm done with you and your crew. Leave us alone." The leader's smile faded, and his tone grew darker. "You think it's that easy? You think you can just walk away from everything you've done? You're coming with us, Jake. We have unfinished business." Jake's mind raced. He didn't have time for a fight. Emma was inside, and she was scared. He had to protect her. But the leader wasn't going to just let him go. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake said firmly. "You're not taking me or anything else from here. Not now. Not ever." The leader's eyes narrowed, and he gestured to the other men. "We'll see about that." As the men started to move toward him, Jake knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let them hurt Emma. He wasn't going to let them take him back to the life he had fought so hard to escape. He had made a decision, and there was no turning back now. Jake lunged forward, his fists connecting with the first man who tried to grab him. He didn't have time to think, just fight. Each punch, each kick, was driven by the one thing that mattered, protecting Emma. The fight was intense, raw, and unrelenting. Jake could feel the pain in his body, the bruises starting to form, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had to finish this. As the last of the men fell to the ground, the leader stood there, watching Jake with a look of disbelief. "You think you've won?" the leader sneered. "This isn't over, Jake." Jake wiped the blood from his lip and stood tall. "It is for me." With that, he turned and walked back toward the house, knowing the battle wasn't over. But at least for now, Emma was safe. For now, they had won. The quiet after the fight was almost as heavy as the storm that had been brewing outside. Jake had won, at least for now. The men who had threatened him were on the ground, nursing bruises, and the leader had backed off, telling him it wasn't over. But Jake knew better. The world around him had shifted in those moments of violence, and he could feel that things would never be the same. The fight was more than just about him anymore. It was about Emma, about protecting her and giving her a future she deserved. As he stepped back toward the house, his heart still raced from the adrenaline, but a sense of relief settled in his chest. He had done what he promised. He had kept her safe. But now came the hard part. He knew they couldn't stay here forever. The men outside, the ones he'd fought off, would come back. They wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. And they wanted him. Jake wasn't going to let Emma get caught in the crossfire. He wasn't going to let her live the way he had, constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering when the next attack would come. When he walked back into the house, Emma was standing in the living room, her small figure illuminated by the dim light from the kitchen. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, and Jake could see the fear still lingering in her gaze. She didn't ask him what happened. She didn't need to. She could see the tension in his body, the blood on his shirt. She could feel the weight of what had just happened, and she knew that things weren't okay. Jake swallowed hard, trying to push down the knot in his throat. He had promised her safety, promised her that everything would be different. But as he looked at her, he knew that promise was beginning to feel like a lie. "It's okay," Jake said softly, though his voice betrayed him. "You're safe." Emma shook her head slightly, her eyes searching his face for something more. "What happens now, Jake?" she asked, her voice small. Jake stood there, for a moment unable to answer. He had spent so much time fighting, so much time running, that he had never stopped to think about what came next. What came after the fight was over? What came after the dust settled? "I don't know," Jake admitted, his voice rough. "But I'll figure it out. We'll figure it out." Emma stepped closer, her small hands gripping his sleeve. She didn't say anything more, but the way she looked at him told him everything he needed to know. She was scared. She had every right to be. Jake could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had to make a choice, and fast. He couldn't keep running. He couldn't keep hiding. He had already sacrificed so much to protect her, but it wasn't enough. The world he had left behind wouldn't let him go that easily. "We need to leave," Jake said, the words finally coming out of his mouth. "We can't stay here. They'll keep coming for us." Emma looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Where will we go?" she asked. Jake didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know where they could go, where they could be safe. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. He wasn't going to let anyone take her away from him. The next few days were a blur. Jake packed up their things, gathering the few belongings they had left. He didn't have much, but Emma didn't need much. She needed him. They left before the sun came up, leaving the small house behind. The town that had been their home for a short time was now a distant memory. The road stretched out before them, empty and open, like the future. Jake didn't know where he was taking them, but he knew they couldn't stay. The bike roared beneath them as they drove through the countryside. The wind whipped through Jake's hair, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts kept drifting back to Emma. She was so small, so innocent. She didn't deserve any of this. She didn't deserve the life he had dragged her into. But she was his responsibility now, and he would protect her at all costs. As they drove, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following them. Every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, the road behind them was empty. But the feeling was there. Someone was watching them. Jake pushed the thought out of his mind, but it lingered in the back of his head. They had been running for days, and he was starting to feel the exhaustion settling in. The tension in his shoulders, the fear that gnawed at him. It was all becoming too much. They needed a place to rest. They needed somewhere safe. He pulled off the road and into a small motel parking lot. It wasn't much, just a small, run-down place on the edge of town, but it would do for now. They couldn't stay in one place for too long, but for tonight, it would be enough. Jake checked in and led Emma to their room. The smell of stale carpet and cheap cleaning supplies hit him as soon as he opened the door. It wasn't pretty, but it was private. Jake locked the door behind them, then collapsed onto the bed. He could feel the tension in his body begin to ease, but he knew it wasn't over. The past was still out there, still chasing them. And soon enough, they would have to face it again. But for tonight, Emma was safe. For tonight, he would let her rest. He would let himself rest. The future was uncertain, but for now, they had each other. And that would have to be enough. It had been a few days since Jake and Emma arrived at the small motel. Jake kept his eyes open, always on alert, but the quietness of the place seemed to ease the tension a bit. For the first time in a long while, he could let his guard down, even if just for a moment. The room was small, but it was theirs for now. Emma had fallen asleep early, exhausted from the stress and fear of the past few weeks. Jake sat in a chair near the window, his eyes scanning the street outside. The world had become a dangerous place, and it seemed like everyone was looking for him. He didn't want to think about it too much. He couldn't. Not with Emma asleep, safe in the other room. But Jake knew that the danger wasn't gone. It was only a matter of time before those people came looking for him again. The tension in the air was thick, and Jake could feel the weight of it pressing down on his chest. The past was never far behind, and it was catching up with him. His phone buzzed on the table beside him. Jake grabbed it quickly, half expecting it to be someone from his past. But it was just a message from Steele. "They're looking for you, Jake. They know you're in town. You need to move. Now." Jake's stomach dropped as he read the message. He had hoped for a few days of peace, a chance to figure things out. But it wasn't going to happen. The people who were after him had found out where he was. It wasn't just a coincidence. They knew. "Emma," Jake whispered to himself, turning his head toward the bedroom door. His mind raced with thoughts of what he needed to do. He had to protect her, keep her safe. That was his priority now. He didn't care about anything else. The fight was coming, and Jake knew he couldn't avoid it much longer. He grabbed his jacket and stood up. His body ached, but he ignored it. He couldn't afford to show any weakness. As quietly as he could, Jake walked over to the bed where Emma was sleeping. She looked so peaceful, her small face relaxed for once, free from the worry and fear she had carried for so long. Jake knelt beside her, brushing a lock of hair from her face. "We have to go, Emma," he whispered softly, careful not to wake her. But Emma stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering open. "Jake?" she said, her voice groggy but filled with concern. Jake forced a smile, trying to reassure her. "It's okay. We're going to be okay. We just have to leave for a little while." Emma sat up, her eyes wide, the fear already returning to her expression. "What's going on? Are they coming for us again?" Jake nodded, his heart breaking at the fear in her voice. "Yes, but we'll be safe. I won't let anything happen to you." Emma looked up at him, and for a moment, Jake saw the child in her again, the child who had once trusted him completely, who believed that everything would be okay. She took a deep breath, wiping the tears from her eyes. "Where are we going, Jake?" she asked. Jake didn't have an answer for her. He didn't know where they were going. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew they couldn't stay here. Not anymore. "We'll figure it out, okay? Just trust me." Emma nodded silently, and Jake could see the determination in her eyes. She trusted him, and that was all that mattered. Together, they left the motel room, stepping out into the cold night air. Jake scanned the parking lot, looking for any sign of danger. The streets were quiet, but that only made the tension more palpable. They couldn't stay here. They couldn't stay anywhere. They had to keep moving. As they walked down the street, Jake's mind was spinning. He didn't have a plan, not really. He didn't know where to go, but he knew he couldn't take Emma back to the chaos. Not after everything they had been through. "We need to get to a safe place," Jake said, more to himself than to Emma. Emma squeezed his hand, as if reminding him that they were in this together. They kept walking, their steps quick and purposeful. Jake's eyes darted around, constantly checking the shadows for any movement. He could feel the weight of the danger on his shoulders, but he wouldn't let it show. He wouldn't let Emma see how scared he really was. They had been running for so long, and it felt like the world was closing in on them. Jake knew that sooner or later, the people who were after him would find them, and when they did, there would be no more running. They had no more places to hide. They had no more time. As they walked through the darkened streets, Jake made a decision. It wasn't a good one, but it was the only one he had. They needed to leave the city. They needed to find somewhere far away, somewhere no one could find them. But that would mean more risks, more danger, more running. Jake hated the idea, but he had no other choice. Emma needed a life without fear. She needed a future, and Jake would do whatever it took to give her that. As they reached the edge of town, the wind picked up, biting at their faces. Jake pulled his jacket tighter around him and glanced at Emma. She was still with him, still holding his hand, still trusting him. And as long as she was with him, Jake would fight. Fight for her future. Fight to keep her safe. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next few days passed in a blur of movement and constant vigilance. Jake and Emma had left the city behind, moving to a small, quiet town far away from the chaos. They rented a small apartment above a corner store, tucked away in a community where no one knew their names, and that was exactly how Jake wanted it. The peace was temporary, though. Every passing car, every shadow that loomed too long, kept him on edge. It was a strange mix of relief and tension. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jake could sleep without worrying about a knock at the door. But even in the quiet, he couldn't stop looking over his shoulder. He had promised Emma a fresh start, a life away from the constant fear of being found, but he knew it wasn't going to last. The men who had been chasing him wouldn't forget. They never did. One afternoon, while Jake was working on a bike at the local garage, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his stomach tightening as he saw the name. Steele. The message was simple, but it sent a chill down Jake's spine. They're getting closer. Move again. They won't stop until they find you. Jake ran his hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the message settle in his chest. He had hoped for more time. He had hoped they could finally have some peace. But deep down, he knew it wasn't going to be that easy. Emma was inside, and for the first time, Jake felt the full weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He had promised her safety, and he was going to keep that promise, no matter what. He couldn't afford to let her down. After he finished the work on the bike, Jake made his way back to the apartment. The familiar knot of fear twisted in his gut as he approached the building. He knew he had to act fast. He couldn't let Emma know what was coming. He couldn't let her see the fear that had been creeping back into his bones. When he walked through the door, Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, coloring. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "Hey, Jake, look what I made," she said, holding up a picture of a sun and a tree, the colors bright and cheerful. Jake forced a smile, walking over to her. "That's great, Emma," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He kissed her forehead, ruffling her hair as he set down his jacket. "I need you to listen carefully, okay?" Emma's smile faded as she looked up at him, sensing the change in his tone. "What's wrong, Jake?" she asked, her voice small. Jake knelt down in front of her, taking her hands in his. He didn't want to scare her, but she was old enough to understand. "We have to go again, Emma," he said softly. "We can't stay here anymore. The people from before, they're getting closer." Emma's eyes widened with fear, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded, her small hand tightening around his. Jake hated doing this to her. He hated the thought of putting her through another round of running, of hiding. But he had no choice. The danger was real, and he had to protect her. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. They packed what little they had, the familiar routine of leaving everything behind setting in once more. Jake knew the stakes were higher this time. They had run far enough to make the men lose their trail, but it wouldn't last. He didn't know how much time they had before the past caught up with them again. As they packed, Jake's mind raced with possibilities. Where could they go? Who could they trust? He had no answers. The only thing he knew for sure was that he had to keep Emma safe. They left the apartment quietly, slipping out into the night. Jake kept his hand firmly around Emma's, guiding her through the dark streets. The air was colder now, the chill settling in with the nightfall. They walked quickly, keeping to the shadows, trying to blend in with the few people out at this hour. It felt like déjà vu, the same fear, the same urgency that had haunted them before. But this time, Jake wasn't going to make the same mistakes. They were going to find a place where they could stay, where Emma could finally have some peace. As they reached the edge of town, Jake heard the unmistakable sound of motorcycles in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. He turned to Emma, seeing the fear in her eyes. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice low but urgent. They kept walking, but Jake could feel the heat of panic rising in his chest. The sound of the engines was getting closer, and soon enough, he could see the headlights of several motorcycles cutting through the night. Jake's body tensed. They had found them. The men had found them. He pulled Emma close, hiding behind a building as the bike sped past. They didn't stop, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. He had no time to waste. They had to keep moving. They couldn't let themselves be caught. As they walked further away from the town, Jake's thoughts raced. He could feel the weight of everything, of the past, of the decisions he had made, of the promise he had made to Emma. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. He wasn't going to let the past take her away from him. No matter what it took, he would protect her. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They couldn't stop running. Not yet. It had been days since they had left the small town, moving from place to place, always on the move, always looking over their shoulders. Jake's mind was a storm of thoughts, but his focus never wavered from one thing: keeping Emma safe. The danger that followed them was relentless, but every step they took, every mile they covered, was a step closer to breaking free from the past. Yet, Jake knew that no matter how far they went, the men after him were still out there, waiting for the moment when they would close in. The nights were the hardest. The fear of being found, of the past catching up, never fully let go. But during the day, with Emma by his side, it was easier to push it aside. She was his anchor, the one thing that kept him grounded. As they traveled, Emma had grown more comfortable in their new life. She still asked questions, where they were going, when they would stop running, but she was no longer terrified. Her smile had returned, and Jake could see the girl she used to be before everything had gone wrong. He would make sure she stayed that way, no matter the cost. They had stopped for the night at an old roadside inn, the kind of place that felt like it had been forgotten by time. It was isolated, surrounded by open fields, and Jake had chosen it for that very reason. He knew it was temporary, but it was the best he could offer right now. The room was small, barely furnished, but it was warm and private. Emma had already claimed the bed, lying on her back with her hands folded behind her head, staring up at the ceiling. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, his thoughts swirling. He had to make a decision. The message from Steele had come through again, a reminder that the men were still out there. It wasn't over. The fight was far from done. But Jake had reached a breaking point. He couldn't keep running forever. He had already lost too much of himself in this fight. His past, his freedom, his peace. But Emma was the one thing he had left to fight for, and that's what mattered. The silence in the room stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the old heater. Emma's soft voice finally cut through it. "Jake," she said, her eyes meeting his. "Are we ever going to stop running?" The question was simple, but it struck Jake like a punch to the gut. He had never wanted her to ask that. He had promised her safety, a future. But the world he had brought her into wasn't safe, and he knew that. He didn't have an answer for her, not one that wouldn't break her heart. "I don't know, Emma," he said quietly, his voice thick with the weight of his failure. "I just know that as long as we're together, we're okay. We'll make it work." Emma's eyes softened, and she shifted, sitting up beside him. "I'm not scared anymore," she said, her voice steady. "I know you'll keep me safe, Jake. You always do." Jake's heart clenched as he looked at her, her face filled with trust, with hope. She had become so much stronger in such a short time, and it was all because of him. She believed in him, and that belief was both a gift and a weight. He couldn't let her down. "Not now, not ever. I'll always keep you safe," Jake said, his voice firm. "I promise." They sat in silence for a while, neither one speaking, just the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of the heater. Jake knew the moment was fleeting. There was no peace in their future, not with the past chasing them down. But he would do whatever it took to protect Emma, to keep her safe, to give her the life she deserved. The world outside the small room was dark, and the weight of everything pressed down on Jake's shoulders. But in that moment, with Emma beside him, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe they could find a way to stop running. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't come without sacrifice. But Jake had learned one thing through all of this. He would fight for Emma. He would fight for her future. And if that meant standing up to his past, then so be it. The next morning, Jake woke up early, before the sun had risen. He packed their things, moving quietly so as not to wake Emma. He didn't want to leave her, but he knew that every second they spent here brought them closer to being found. They had to leave. As Jake loaded their bags into the car, he took one last look at the small motel room. It had been a temporary refuge, but it was time to move on. They were going to keep moving, keep running. But this time it would be different. This time, Jake would make sure they were ready. As he started the car and pulled away, he glanced over at Emma, still sleeping in the passenger seat. Her face was peaceful, untouched by the fear that had haunted her for so long. Jake's heart swelled with determination. This was the life he had promised her. And no matter what it took, he would keep that promise. They would stop running. They would stand their ground. They would face whatever came their way, together.